Most of you have probably read quite a bit or heard quite a bit about the Holocaust, and you've probably heard about concentration camps and all the horrible and horrific things that have happened to people and all the 6 million people that were murdered. My story is different. I was not in a concentration camp, but nevertheless, I suffered greatly due to the Nazi regime. So today, I'll tell you my experience during World War II. And I'm going to start off with my family and tell you about them and introduce them. As you can see, I was born in SARNY, Poland, and the population of the town was rather small, about 3,500 Jewish people and about 3,500 Polish or Catholic people. And we lived together but apart, did business together but weren't friends. And every group had its own organization, its own support system, and but got along, basically. This is I. You know, people tell me I look cute. Yeah. So, and this picture, was taken when shortly after I was born. It was a New Year's card that my mother had sent to the United States to her two sisters who came to the United States in 1910 or 1911. And if you can figure out on the bottom, I was born in 5696 in the month of Adar. This is my mother's family. It's an old picture, very old picture. And the little girl on the bottom over there is my mother. So that's my grandmother, my grandfather, and my mother was one of 9 children. This picture, since it was way before the war started and way before I was born, does not represent the family as it was during the Holocaust. It was expanded. Everybody, almost everybody was married. Those 2 girls that I mentioned before, Esther and Gassi on the top, came to the United States in 1910, and they were about 16 and 17, although I think they lied. They told them they were 18. Of course, when it came to Social Security getting, they couldn't get it. They had to wait extra. So this is my father. He came from a nearby town, and he was a barber and a free thinker. A free thinker was somebody who was not Orthodox. Most of the people in the shtetls, in the villages, were Orthodox. The Jewish people were Orthodox. And they tried their best to observe all the commandments in the Hebrew Bible, all 613 commandments in the Hebrew Bible. So, but they did the best they could. So, I was quite young when World War II started, and Germany had attacked Poland from all directions in a blitzkrieg. You probably are familiar with all this. I usually speak to children, so I have to keep it at a very low level. So if I use language that seems low to you, consider, I'm not used to talking to adults. So, but as I say, Germany attacked Poland in September of 1939. But what you are probably aware of is that about a month or so before World War II started, Germany and the USSR, Russia, signed a pact. Basically, Germany, the Nazi regime of Germany, told Russia, look, we're going to start a war. We're going to, take Poland. You guys sit back, don't do anything, and we will give you part of Poland. So basically, they bribed Russia at the very beginning. And so, as soon as the war started, the Russians moved their border from their normal borders to the agreed-to pact with Nazi in Germany. And it so happens that, oops, sorry. It so happened that my town, which was around here, you see Minsk over there, right below Minsk, was in that area. And so we came under Russian occupation. No longer were we governed by Poland, it was all Russia now. And the Russian military came in and took over all the military operations in town. What was happening on the other side of the border, of the Russian border, is that as soon as the Nazis came in, they immediately began to set up concentration camps, ghettos, rounding up the Jewish people in the area, and the gypsies, the Jehovah's Witnesses, all kinds of groups that they didn't care for, and putting them in concentration camps. The Russians, on the other hand, were fairly humane occupiers. They had occupied Poland a number of times before, and so the Russians were kind of used to the Poles were kind of used to the Russians, and knew their method of operation. So what was happening, of course, at the time is that the Jews that were on the German side of Poland were trying to escape. And so the Jewish population of my town, of SARNY, I keep saying town, it's not a town, it's a village, okay? The shtetl, began to grow, and it grew to about a population of about 7,000, it doubled. What was happening at the same time is that my father got drafted into the Russian army. So we have about a year and a half, almost 2 years, that the war was going on. Not too much happening on the Russian side of Poland. Supposedly the Russians and the Germans are friends. They signed a pact. We're going to be buddies, What happens? They attacked Russia. Germany attacked Russia, and didn't take long before they occupied the territory that they ceded before to the Russians. Because my father was in the army, he was able to get necessary paperwork to get my mother and myself onto a train that was leaving SARNY and heading towards deeper into Russia. And so he was, he got us into this cattle car, pushed us in, and the cattle car was full of women and children, and everybody crying, everybody upset. And I have to tell you, certain things I remember, but certain things my mother said and repeated a number of times, and it got into my memory, so it may not be my own memory, but it came from a source that was very close to me. And so I know it happened, okay? So my mother, and I were in this cattle car. The train begins to move, and we're, a couple of minutes, 15, 20 minutes out of the station, and a German airplane came flying, and he was strafing the train. He kept going up and down, shooting at the train. The train stopped. My mother and I and everybody else started jumping out of the cars, and running in all directions. and the airplane is flying back and forth and shooting. He continued for a period of time and then took off. Probably ran out of bullets or ran out of gas, but he took off. A lot of people were hurt, a lot of people were killed. We got back on the train. Those who could got back on the train, and the train took off again. We were about a few minutes away, and again, another airplane came. And this time, the same thing happened. The conductor stopped the train, people began to jump out, and my mother and I jumped out of the train kettle car. And as she did, my mother fell. I continued to run. Being a young child, I just continued to run. According to my mother, when she looked up, she saw me a distance away. She saw something explode, and she got up and started running towards me. And she said that she was running and screaming and saying, "Favos esti opgelost, favos esti opgelost." She was speaking Yiddish to me. My first language was Yiddish. So we were speaking Yiddish, so she was running towards me and looking for me, and she came to where the explosion occurred, and she saw this, this pit, and then she saw this rim of dirt, and laying beside the rim of dirt, she saw me. And she fell on top of me and started shaking me and screaming, and I was out, But after a while, she was shaking me, and I opened up my eyes. And according to her, I said, "Why are you screaming, Mommy? Why are you screaming?" And she hugged me so hard that at times I still remember that hug. I still can feel it. It's funny, but here we are, 75 years later, and I can still feel her hug occasionally. So it does happen. So the train finally, we continued, and we got to close to Stalingrad. The train stopped, and we got out, and everybody else got out. That's as far as the train went. And we got out at Stalingrad and finally wound up going to Saratov, and my mother found a place to work on a farm. Basically, she was working for food, and we were there for a period of time when until the attack on Stalingrad came. Most of you are probably familiar with the Battle of Stalingrad, and you know that the Nazis first attacked Moscow. They couldn't take it. They came down the Volga River and attacked Stalingrad. Stalingrad was one of the most horrific battles of World War II. 1.5 million people on both sides were killed at Stalingrad. What was happening at the time, of course, is that the Russians weren't ready for the war. Even though they knew about it for years ahead, years back, they still weren't ready. But they did have a lot of manpower. And so at the Battle of Stalingrad, they used to issue, for every 2 soldiers, they would give them 1 gun and 6 bullets and send them out. And that's, it sent out thousands and thousands, And of course, the Nazis had machine guns and all kinds of stuff, and so they were kind of buying time by killing their people. So Mom continued to, Mom found the job, and she was there for a period of time. And when the attack on Stalingrad happened, again, it was too close. And so we decided to leave and to get away too close to the Nazis. And so what was happening at the same time as the Russians had set up the war industry deep in the Ural Mountains. I don't know if you can see, probably can't see it, but the Ural Mountains, you see the word Ufa over there? That's where the Ural Mountains were. And Ufa, near Ufa, there was a camp originally, and that's where they decided to move all the war industry. And so all kinds of barracks were built in Ufa, and all kinds of people were brought in. And so thousands and thousands of people lived, were brought into this camp to work the factories. We wound up on a train that took us to Ufa, and we were assigned to a barracks with another family. And the barracks was very long, much longer than this building, much longer than American barracks. And it was uninsulated, and there were little cubicles throughout. And we were assigned to a cubicle with another family, a family of another mother and 2 children. So the 5 of us were in this cubicle of about 9 by 9, and this area didn't have much in it, didn't have anything in it. Yeah, all it had is 2 straw mattresses, basically pillowcases filled with straw, and a bucket. And the bucket was our toilet. The living conditions were very, very poor. No heat, no electricity, and as I said, bucket for the toilet. The mattresses served as our bed, and also as our mattress, as our sitting. We'd take in the morning, we'd get up, we'd roll up the mattress, put it against the wall, and that's what we sat on. And the area, the Ural Mountains are a very cold area. It's for most part, you have about 9 months of winter and 3 months of spring, summer, and fall. So, you're constantly freezing. But we kept surviving, we kept living on, and everybody in the camp, all the adults in the camp had to work. All the children attended school. As I told you, the temperature, is always, seldom above 0. My mother, when she would come back from work, she would look like this. This is not my mother, by the way, but she would look like that. My picture of her, in all the years we were there, was always, she'd come back from work, she'd look like this. She'd come in, she would be shivering, she would sit down against the wall, and she would throw the other mattress on her, and she would shiver for a period of time, and then when she regained her composure, she would, she would start preparing some kind of a meal for the 2 of us. The area is so cold, that if you have any exposure to, for a couple of minutes to the below freezing temperature, it doesn't take long before you get frostbite. And one day my mother came back to the barracks, and she sat down, and we noticed that her finger had turned black. She evidently didn't cover it enough, and it turned black, and it had to be amputated because frostbite, as many of you know, grows, just continues to go. Had they left it going for a period of time, she probably would have lost her hand, but she was lucky. They just amputated her finger. So we survived, we kept on going. When we first got to RAIVKA, our clothes were still decent, but you wear it 24 hours a day, sleeping in it and eating in it, and it doesn't take long before you develop holes all over the place. And so they were patched, etc. Now, I had an additional problem. I was growing, and my shoes were torn. My mother would try to barter with other women for an item of clothes, shirts or a pants, And whenever she got an item of clothes, she would go through a process. She would take this pot. When we got into RAIVKA, we had brought with us a sack, and all our belongings were in this sack. Among the items that we had was a pot. And in that one pot, my mother cooked, my mother baked, my mother washed clothes, and we washed ourselves in it. You'd be surprised that you really don't need all this stuff that we've got, You can get along without it. Not that easy, but we get along. But in any event, whenever she got an item of clothes, she would go through this process of taking snow, melting it on the stoves, bringing it to a boiling, taking the item of clothes and boiling it. And I would stand there and look as the lice and the vermin would come up to the top, because everything was covered in lice. Everything was covered in vermin, and it's so, yeah, that was my fun. I enjoyed watching that, So, my shoes, I mentioned, were torn, and my mother, whenever she'd find an item, a piece of cardboard or whatever, and she would stick it into my shoes to try to keep the snow out. Didn't help, but there weren't any available. She couldn't barter for a pair of shoes. So, but again, we kept on going. Now, two things bother me to this very day. One is cold, and the other one is hunger. In all the time that we were in RAIVKA, I never felt satisfied, as far as the meal was concerned. But we survived, we kept on living and eating anything we could. But see, everybody in the camp had to work, and of course, everybody got paid for working. So every month, there would be trucks, and every family would get their payment. And the trucks would bring in a sack of potatoes and about 10 pounds of flour. And that was my mother's payment for the month. We had to survive on that. So, not easy. My mother, when she found the root or leaves, etc., she would go through a process again, She would take that pot, take the root, and bang on it, and bang on it, So what are you doing? Well, she was trying to break it down to a flour, to something that she could mix it with, And she would take that root flour and mix it with a little bit of real flour. And one day we would have root pancakes, and another day we would have leaf pancakes. Whatever she found, she was able to use. Now, don't misunderstand me. The Russians were not trying to punish us. This was the norm at the time. They did their best to provide for the workers, but they just didn't have it. They had a horrible war going on, people getting killed left and right, and they did their best to support it. Occasionally, trucks would come in, and everybody would get a piece of salami, or the next time, a piece of cheese. So yeah, they tried. They tried to support the people, but just didn't have it. Now, as I told you, everybody had to work, and everybody had a quota. So if you were making bullets, for example, you had to make a certain amount of bullets per day. If you were, making tanks, you had to do certain whatever work you had to do, you had a specific number you had to meet. And my mother always exceeded the quota, as far as I know. Because every 2 weeks, she would come back with this loaf of bread. It was about this size. Black bread. And she would take this loaf of bread, and she would put it down, and she would cut it up into 14 pieces. And she would say, well, this is for Monday, and this is for Tuesday, and she would go through the calendar. So we knew each day we had a piece of bread. Now she would take this pieces of bread and put it on the windowsill. I didn't tell you, but the barracks had windows, small windows, very high up. As a young child, I couldn't even look out. I couldn't see out, and I always wondered, why would they put the windows so high, Well, it didn't take long after we got there, I found out. Because when it snows in the Ural Mountain, it's not inches, and it's not feet, it's yards, and so the windows are put up purposely that high. So, we kept on going and going, surviving as best we could. When we first got to RAIVKA, and I used to take out every child had a task as well, and my task was to take out the bucket in the morning. And so I'd get up in the morning, I'd grab the bucket, go out to the pit, which was a couple of 100 yards away, and throw it in, because it was frozen most of the time. When it wasn't frozen, I walked very gingerly. But for the most part, it was frozen. But whenever I was at the pit at the beginning, I'd see trees way ahead. I'd see animals occasionally around the pit, rats and mice and other animals. But as the years went by, the rats disappeared, the mice disappeared. The trees that I used to see kept moving further and further back, and before long I couldn't even see the trees at all. So things kept changing, but occasionally there would be a rat, and there'd be a posse who would be chasing it down, because whoever caught that rat, had a good meal that day. So, again, we survived. We kept on going. What you see over here is what most people looked like. Most people were undernourished and looked just like that. Skin and bones, that was the norm. As I told you, the kids, including myself, had to attend school. And that's where, actually I spoke Russian before, but I became proficient in Russian. And attended school, and we were there for a period of time, months. And then, like any other kid, had fun, had good days, bad days, etc. But one day I came in, and these guys began to bully me. They began to call me names, they called me Zhid, which is, in Russian, is a derogatory name for a Jew, and began to poke me and to hit me, and I didn't know what was going on, And I remember going back, talking to my mother about it that night, I said, what is this? Why are they doing this, And she said, well, the only thing that she could surmise is that somebody had found out that we were Jewish and were talking among themselves, and the kids may have overheard it, and, but were they learned to be nasty towards Jews, I don't know, but that's what we learned, is that they must have heard it from their parents because they didn't do it before, or from their family. And so this went on for a period of time. Every time I'd come to school, I'd get bullied, I'd get called names. But some of my friends came to my defense, and actually towards the end, they would actually form a cordon around me, They'd see the bullies coming, they'd stand up and beside me, and be around me. And finally, the bullies gave up because it was no fun, not being able to do for them. So every evening after the first shift would come back from work, the shifts were operational 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And whenever the first shift came back from work, the camp commander would turn on the loudspeakers outside. And the Russian radio would come on, and there would be songs, patriotic songs, and the news of the day. And I remember very distinctly looking so forward to that. Sometimes I'd wake up in the morning, I'd say to my mother, I can't wait till you come back from work. And she'd say, why? I'd say, well, so I can hear the radio, So that was the only contact that we had with the outside world. Of course, it was all propaganda. The Russians never lost a battle. They always, they were always winning. They were always succeeding. They were always, that's all we heard. Everything was going great. So finally, the war ended. Germany surrendered. And the war industry was no longer necessary. And so all these thousands of people who were building guns and ammunitions and tanks and no longer had a job. And so they began to walk home. They began to go home. And when I say go home, that's exactly what they looked like. Whatever the belongings they had, they put on their back, and they walked. And they walked for days, weeks, and months, and kept going in that, didn't know where, but in that direction. And occasionally, they'd come to a railroad track. We would come to the railroad. And there'd be thousands of people sitting along the railroad track waiting for a train. I don't know how long they'd wait for. Sometimes days, sometimes weeks, and whenever a train came by, though, everybody would jump on, no matter what it is. They'd get on the top, they'd get on the sides, they get, whatever they could. So that's how people got home. So in the spring of '46, my mother and I began the trek back to Poland, back to our town. And let's say occasionally there'd be a truck that we could pick up, get on. But for most part, we walked. We walked for days, we walked for weeks, we walked for months. And finally, we got to the town where I was born. And we learned what happened in SARNY, that as soon as the Nazis came in, they immediately set up a ghetto and rounded up all the Jews and all the gypsies and all the Poles and all the that were against the regime, and set them in this ghetto, and had about 14,000 people in this camp. And then they decided to liquidate the camp. So they set up machine guns around the camp and began to murder the people. This went on for a period of time. And unfortunately, my family got wiped out. The only survivors were, of course, the two girls who were in the United States, and the little baby over there, and my mother. let me correct one more thing. My grandfather had died before that. He died before the war started. He died in 1936 because I'm named after him. You know, in Jewish tradition, you name people after a dead person. And so I have his name that I carry on. So, but that's not the whole family. By that time, there was a large extended family. And so you think only these people got murdered. No, it's their brothers and sisters and extended family that they married into. So no, it was quite a horrific time. And we learned when we were in SARNY that my father had died was killed at Stalingrad. There is no documentation, but he never came back. And the information we had was somebody saw him at the battle, of Stalingrad. So. If you go to the internet and look up SARNY, you'll see mass graves like that around SARNY. And those 14,000 people that I mentioned, they're in those mass graves. So what do you do? Here we are back in SARNY. Our house is demolished. The Nazis had gone through SARNY and for some reason demolished everything in sight. My mother at first she couldn't even tell where the street was. Where the house was. And so what do you do? What do you do? Well, luckily, the US Army came to the aid of everybody. They originally set up DP camps, displaced persons camps, pretty much throughout Europe. And the displaced persons camp were organized on a basis of where you came from and what your destination is. So if you were going, let's say, to Australia, you were in one camp. If you were going to the United States, you were in a different camp. If you're going to France, you were in another camp. But they were distributed throughout Europe. And so to get into one of those camps, you pretty much had to show some documentation that indeed you have somebody in a certain country. You couldn't go to the United States without showing that you have family or somebody there. We didn't have anything. And the only people who would take us at the time was the camps that was set up to go to Palestine, to go to Israel. They didn't ask any questions. If you were a Jew, you could come in, okay. So the camp was set up in Hallein by Salzburg. See over there, it says. And so, we began the journey to get from SARNY to Hallein. This time it was better organized, there were some shlichim or special people that came in from the DP camp to try to show you the way, to try to lead you. And so again, we began the track from SARNY to Hallein. And we walked and we had buses and occasionally trucks, etc. And after a period of time, we finally got there. But at the time I was, almost 11. No, I was 9 at the time, I'm sorry. And I liked to play by myself. I liked to play, and so whenever we'd stop, and sometimes we'd be in one place for a couple of days, and we'd rest and have some food, etc., and we'd move on. And when I say we, there were thousands. We weren't the only ones, okay? So we kept moving on. And as a young child, I'd run off and look for for treasures, you know. I'd look for factories. One day we were in RAIVKA, and we came across a factory and went inside, and it was a gigantic place, you know, and I saw this pile of trash. And I went to it and examined it, and I saw something shining on the top. And climbed up. And as I reached for it, it reached for me. My hand went across it, and I couldn't let go. It was a high tension cable, and evidently it was aluminum. Okay, so I couldn't let go, and I kept shaking, and finally passed out. And not quite sure what happened. But when I came through, I was laying at the bottom of the pile, and people were standing around me. And I remember hearing very distinctly, "He's alive," So they took me to this, to the camp area, and gave me castor oil. That was worse than the shock, I tell you. We finally got to Hallein. And this is the DP camp in Hallein by Salzburg. And this was heaven, I mean, the people had clothes, we had heat. My mother and I actually had separate beds, It was a cot, my mother had a cot and I had a cot, so we weren't sleeping on the floor anymore. And that was, and we ate in this gigantic mess hall. And just as much food as you wanted, And so my stomach began to grow, And it was just heaven. And of course, since everybody in that camp was designated to go to Palestine or Israel at the time, the organizers wanted to make sure that people had professions that were productive, could do productive work. And so all the adults had to learn, if they didn't have a profession or a trade, they had to learn a trade. So everybody was attending school and learning things. And the same with the kids. The kids all attended school. And it was a totally Hebrew school. We spoke Hebrew. It was just Hebrew. We couldn't speak any other language. We could, so it was an immersion type school. And so every kid began to learn Hebrew, and that's where I learned Hebrew. And so time went by, and we thought, one of these days our turn will come and we'll go to Israel. But what was happening at the time is there were many organizations, and among them the Hayas was one of the organizations that were looking to reunite families. And they had been working on my family, my mother's family, to try to find them. My mother had told them she knows she has had two sisters there, in the United States. Well, finally, they found my mother's sister. And that was the happiest day my mother ever had. I remember when we got the news, she was so overjoyed. She actually was dancing on the table. She was dancing all over. She was jumping around, Can you imagine when you think you've lost everything and finally found, her two sisters? And my aunts immediately sent us a visa, come to the United States. We'll take care of everything. We'll provide for you. We'll make sure you have a job. We'll make sure, And they immediately sent us, after weeks, they sent us a visa. And we thought, we're going to the United States. And so we thought, any week now, any day now, we're going to go to the United States. Well, what was happening at the time is that the United States had quotas. And especially for Jewish people, they had quotas. And so the quotas were based on different lists. There was a list for people born in Russia, and a list for people born in Poland, etc. So depending where you were born, that's the list you were on. Now, Poland had the most Jews, in Europe, and so, originally. So the survivors, those who survived, it was a long list. And so we waited almost 5 years till our turn came to come to the United States legally. While in the camp, my mother met Ira Segalewitz, who was a partisan in the Russian army. There were partisans operating separately from the Russian army, some operating with the Russian army. And he had lost his wife and 2 children. And so my mother got married. I had my bar mitzvah there, and finally our turn came to come to the United States. First we had a false turn. We had to go to Germany and then come back to Austria. Nothing came easy. But finally our turn came. And so in July of '51, we boarded the ship to go to the United States. This is my immigration papers. My mother and myself, we finally arrived in Brooklyn after a horrible journey on a Liberty ship. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Liberty ships, but they're small. My aunts had provided for a place in their basement for us, and my parents, my mother and my stepfather, within a week they were working and trying to make a living. I very distinctly remember my first day in the United States. I got up early in the morning. It must have been, 6 o'clock or so. And everybody was still asleep. And my aunt had provided for me white shoes, sneakers, white pants, white shirt, so I was totally in white. And I put on all that, went outside. The sun was shining, and the grass was green. And I laid down on the grass and I said, this must be heaven. And it did turn out to be heaven for me anyway, Yes, this was heaven. This is heaven. So, throughout July and August, and I played with the other kids. The kids were very good to me. They all knew about the Holocaust. They all knew about the things that happened. And so they would try to engage me and to play with them and do things. I couldn't speak English at all when we got here. My cousin, who spoke Yiddish, would translate for me. And but the kids had, they would be, I remember one incident, we were standing outside, it was a Sunday, all the kids were playing around, and said, come on, Ira, we're gonna go to the movies today. And I said, I can't go. My English was still pretty poor at that time. I can't go, and they kept insisting, come on, you'll enjoy the movie, it's Hopalong Cassidy, so you'll enjoy it. And this distant cousin who was standing on the stoop nearby, she was watching what was going on, and after they asked me a couple of times, she realized what was happening, and she came over and she shook my hand. And when she shook my hand, she put $1 in it. She understood that I didn't have the 50 cents to go to the movies, And, to this day, if I think of a righteous person, if I think the word righteous, Xena comes to my mind. Yeah. But, time went on. So finally, they had to register me in school. So my cousin took me to Tilton High School. And at the school, they kept asking her all kinds of questions. I didn't quite understand everything that transpired. But after a while, my cousin would turn around to me and say, "Wie alt bist du? How old are you?" And I would tell her it's going to be 16 in February. And she would say, "He's going to be 16 in February." And they kept shuffling us from one office to another, and we finally went to another office, and again, the same thing, and she would say, "He's going to be 16 in February." And we finally wound up with the principal, and she, too, said, "How old is he?" And that's when I answered her, "He's going to be 16 in February." So that's how I learned English, see? Exposure. So, went to Tilden. They put me in a third term, by the way. No ESL at the time. No support. One teacher did give me 2 books, said, "Read these books." Couldn't read English. "Read these books," but I persevered. I learned. So finally, I graduated from Tilden High School after 2.5 years and went into the service, into the Army. What the Army was doing at the time is they needed people, and so they provided an extra year of a year of training if you took an extra year. So if you signed up for 3 years, you got a year of training. And so I had a piece of paper saying I wanted to be in communications, I wanted to be in electronics. And so, I had this document saying, Ira is going to go to school for a year, okay? So, but when you go into the Army, as you're probably aware, you take all kinds of aptitude tests. And at the time, I was speaking 6 languages. And so they immediately said, "You're going to be an interpreter. You're going to be a Russian interpreter. You're going to go to UCLA." I says, "No, I'm going to electronics school. That's what I signed up for." "Oh, no, you're going to, So this went on, and I kept going from the sergeant to the lieutenant to the colonel, up the chain of command. Finally wound up with the inspector general, who said, "All right, you've got a piece of paper that says you're going to go to electronics school, but if your grade dropped below a B, you're going to UCLA." Well, it never dropped below a B. And so I got into the service, went to a year of training, and at that time they had a number of new things that were coming out, new inventions. And I wound up teaching at Fort Benning advanced commissioned officers, colonels and up. So I had colonels and generals basically as my students. And I had to teach them how to use the equipment, how to use tactics with that equipment. And so did that for a period of time, then wound up in Korea, spent 14 months in Korea. And finally came back, married the girl I had met before going into the service, and we have 4 sons, and now I have 6 grandchildren. Unfortunately, my wife passed away a couple of years back. So, when I was very lucky after I came out of the service and after I went back to school, after I got my degree, I worked for some very prestigious companies at the time. Boris Corporation, we put in the first stationary orbit, actually for them, the computerized tracking system for the Air Force. And then the first stationary orbit, and different projects. I ran the operations throughout Europe for the armed forces. I put in the NATO projects, NATO communications, and finally became president of one of the ITT companies, educational companies. And that's my story. So thank you all for listening. All right, if you have any questions, you're welcome to call them out, and we'll try to repeat them. Anybody have no questions? That's great. Yeah.
How many languages do you speak?
I spoke 6. I don't speak maybe 3 now. Languages are a memory device. If you don't use it, you forget it. And I haven't used some of the languages in a long time. I still speak a little bit of Hebrew. I still speak a little bit I speak a lot of Yiddish, actually. And I speak, occasionally some Russian, occasionally some Polish, but not anymore. So, yeah. Anybody else? Well, thank you.
Did you encounter, other than your immediate family, once you got to the United States, did you encounter anybody else from your hometown?
No, nobody. Some distant friends that my mother knew from, but none of the family survived. The little child that was, that you saw, she wound up in Israel, and of course, that's the only family that survived besides my mother. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
When did you know what happened to the other Jews? Like when you came back, how did you know what happened?
Well, it was quite obvious what had happened to the people in my town, and of course everybody knew in the town. All the Polish people knew exactly what happened. And we've heard of stories throughout, So we actually heard about it as soon as we left the DP camp. The RAIVKA, as soon as we left the Russian camp. Mm-hmm.
It was recently in the news that Polish government dissolved or refused any claim for any participation. What's your thought on that?
Well, it's absolutely wrong, but I'm not supposed to talk about this politics over here. You have somebody?
Did you ever have a close friend through high school? Like a best friend that got you through high school?
Right, yes. But he was a refugee too. Yeah. But he was a little bit ahead of me. He had been there for, the beginning of the high school. But, yeah. And we were friends for a long time. So, yeah.
How did you feel when you first came to America?
Outstanding. Outstanding. I told you the story about my first day, and that persists to this very day. I think I travel a lot, and I traveled a lot for my job, and I've seen almost, many, many countries. Nobody's got it as good as we do. Nobody's got as much freedom as we do. We can say things, we can call the president every name we call. You try doing it in any other country, you're going to wind up in jail pretty fast, So, yeah, we've got it right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
The freedom that you have here is the favorite part of this country, or what would you say your favorite part is?
The freedom? I couldn't quite hear you.
Is the freedom your favorite part about this country, or is there something else you like?
Oh, there are many things. Yeah, freedom is probably the major thing, yes, But yeah, there's so many good things about this country that I can talk about in day and night, and, well, unfortunately, all these people who berate our country haven't been anyplace else. They don't know what it's like to be under different rulers and different ways of doing things. So if they were exposed to some of the education and some knowledge, they'd probably talk differently.
You said that you all were scarce on clothing. Were you permitted to probably take some clothing from someone that was deceased, someone that had passed away?
I don't know what happened to that clothing. There was, as a child, I don't know what happened. The government groups, the people in charge were handling it, so I don't know if they kept it to themselves or they gave it to people who needed it the most. Can't answer your question.
How did you end up in Dayton, Ohio?
Never thought I'd be here. Really, for almost 30 years, I worked for ITT, and I ran projects, communication projects throughout Ohio. I was instrumental in putting in your television systems through here, at least the communications and all the agency telephone and telegraph. Not telegraph. All the telephone and all the other communications throughout the state. So for the longest time, I was working with the state of Ohio. But my first granddaughter was born in Pittsburgh, and when her parents decided to come to Dayton and become professors at UD, I had to follow her. So, okay. Yeah. Thank you all very much.